the November 7th, 2017 work session for the Portland City Council. Today we're here to talk about our federal and our state legislative agendas. Elizabeth.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning. Good morning, Mayor Wheeler, commissioners. My name is Elizabeth Edwards, Interim Director with the Office of Government Relations, and my team and I are pleased to be before you today to discuss the draft state and federal legislative agendas for 2018. The format of today is we're going to start with the federal agenda, and then we'll move to the state agenda, and in each presentation, guided by PowerPoint slides, we'll provide a little bit of context for the political climates in Washington, D.C., and then Salem before walking through some of the top-line issues in the draft agendas, and then we'll pause in between to take questions. And before I go any further, I just want to stop and acknowledge the work of our legislative liaisons and thank them for the work that they contributed and have put a great deal of sort of help and advice in helping to prepare these draft agendas before you today. So thank you to our legislative liaisons. With that, we'll move on into the federal side. So with me today are Vicki Cram, the city's Washington, D.C. representative, and Niels Tilstrom, our federal government relations manager. What we'll do is I'm going to cover an overview of the 115th Congress, our federal delegation, and some of the accomplishments we saw from the last year. And then Vicki will cover important dates and give us some of that on-the-ground perspective of the key issues that are coming up. And then Niels will discuss the draft federal agenda. So looking at this sort of first slide with content on it, in the 115th Congress, Republicans continued to control both chambers as well as the executive branch. And in the executive branch, we continue to see some pretty big vacancies, notably the Secretary of Health and Human Services and the Secretary of Homeland Security. Vacancies also abound in the State Department and across other departments as well, including agriculture, interior, labor, education. It's kind of across the board. Looking specifically at Congress, the House is comfortably held by a Republican majority of 239 Republicans to 194 Democrats with 2 current vacancies. The Senate's a lot closer. So you have 52 Republicans to 46 Democrats with 2 independents that tend to caucus with the Democrats.
And how many are up for re-election today? Or how many seats are at play with today's elections?
So in the Senate, you typically have a third turnover. That way they have enough overlap for their 6-year terms.
But all of the
But
House?
they're not until next year.
Not until next year.
Yeah,
So
yeah, and all of the houses.
All of the House every 2 years, and a third
Next
of the
year.
Senate every 2 years.
So what are the things that are happening today?
What are the...
There are
The governor's race.
Governor's race in Virginia.
And I think the split today is something like 35-15, right? R's versus D's at the governor's mansions?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or roughly that.
so it's also those kinds of races are on the ballot
Yeah,
today?
mayoral
Okay.
and
Thank you.
gubernatorial races.
Excuse me.
Oh, and we should say also our PCC bond measure today, right?
Yep.
Get your vote in if you haven't already.
Looking ahead at our Oregon delegation, although we only have 7 members, they're in really strong positions. Senator Wyden is the ranking member on the Senate Finance Committee. Merkley is on the powerful Appropriations Committee. Congressman DeFazio is the ranking member on Transportation. Congressman Walden is the chair of the House Energy and Commerce Committee, where Congressman Schrader also serves. Congresswoman Bonamici is on the Education and the Workforce Committee, and Congressman Blumenauer is on House Ways and Means. And over the past year, the city has directly and personally engaged with each of these members of our Oregon delegation. And speaking of the last year, we have the next slide, which is a little small, and we can provide a larger version of this, is some of the accomplishments during 2017. So while the administration has certainly been adversarial to cities, and Congress has been really slow to act on big pieces of legislation, Portland has actually been able to tally some wins, even in this difficult climate. So we were able to get $2.9 million for the Portland Bureau of Emergency Management for the Urban Area Security Initiative, which goes toward regional disaster preparedness. Portland led a successful effort to get the entire Oregon congressional delegation to sign on to a letter to the Environmental Protection Agency communicating the importance of moving forward with cleanup on Portland Harbor Superfund. And we had the opportunity to testify before the House Energy and Commerce Committee on Smart Cities and talk about how cities, how future legislation can help cities be successful on our equity goals, our safety goals, and our cleaner air goals. As part of this, we also facilitated trips for members of council, their staff, and bureau staff to come out to DC and to have those contacts. And we had numerous direct engagement also through letters with our delegation. So we've been keeping in touch even when things seem bleak 3,000 miles away.
Just a quick comment. The last time I had the pleasure of being in DC with Vicki and Niels and the team, one of the visits was to the Legal Service Corporation headquarters, and we got a chance to meet with their general counsel. And if you might recall, the president's first budget called for zeroing out legal services. In our downtime waiting for the meeting, we were looking at all the things on the walls, both in the main area and then later in the executive suite. And the one thing we could not find was anything from the state of Oregon celebrating legal services. And every other state was represented with something that was framed and beautiful. So we were all deeply aggrieved. And our friends at the Campaign for Equal Justice worked with a couple of folks, put together something, sent it to the general counsel. It's now outside of his office. That's awesome. So Vicki, we have righted that wrong.
Good. That's actually a great transition. I'm going to turn things over to Vicki. Talk a little bit about the political landscape in DC and some key dates coming up.
Good morning, mayors and commissioners. For the record, I'm Vicki Cram. I'm a principal at Squire Patton Boggs in Washington, D.C., and of course, it's a pleasure to be here, as always, in Portland. I'm going to go quickly over this first slide with some of the key budget dates, and then the considerations I'm going to wrap into my longer presentation on all the complexities and moving pieces in Washington right now. December 8th is the date that the FY18 continuing resolution, which is funding the federal government at FY17 levels because they could not come to an agreement on appropriations bills yet. December 8th is the date that the continuing resolution expires, along with the National Flood Insurance Program extension. January is when, usually about mid-January, is when the 115th Congress will reconvene for its second session. February is when the president will submit his budget. And this will be his first real budget as president, the previous one having been sort of cobbled together at the, because he was brand new. And then in February, of course, the delegation asks for funding priorities, and we submit a number of our funding priorities, including the home program, CDBG, UASI, a number, we've probably about 12 or 16 appropriations requests every year. And then September 30th is, of course, the end of the federal fiscal year of FY18, but I can guarantee you they probably won't have passed all their appropriations bills by then. So as I mentioned, in terms of the budget and FY18, the fiscal year began October 1st, but Congress could not finalize the appropriations bills to fund the federal government, so they passed the short-term continuing resolution aforementioned to fund government operations at FY17 levels until December 8th. With the continuing resolution set to expire in a month and pressure to complete tax reform by the end of the year, there's little time to negotiate a bipartisan budget agreement, even if there were a will to, and right now there doesn't seem to be a will to. Similar to those negotiated in 2013 and 2015. Without such an agreement, Congress is limited to the budget caps imposed by the 2011 Budget Control Act. So Republicans are arguing for more defense spending, while Democrats want equal investments in domestic spending. The good news is that Congress, as they work through the appropriations bills that they didn't complete, has rejected most of the draconian budget cuts and program eliminations proposed by President Trump's FY18 budget. But the bad news is, including the Legal Services Corporation, but the bad news is that without an overarching budget agreement, sequestration, which are mandatory across the board spending cuts will kick in, and we anticipate that'll be somewhere between 7 and 10%. So if they don't pass the budget, that's going to be a consequence across the board. Further complicating matters are a number of potentially deal-breaking issues that might need to be addressed in any end-of-year package. And those include the health insurance stabilization legislation, bipartisan legislation that I'll mention in a minute, the President's desire for a $1.57 billion border wall, which he says he won't sign any appropriations, end-of-year appropriations deal without. The Child's Health Insurance Program, which I will discuss in a minute, needs to be reauthorized, and the National Flood Insurance Program as well. And action on deferred action for childhood arrivals is something that the Democrats very much want to see in a end-of-year package. So it is very unlikely that a budget agreement will be implemented by December 8th. It is more likely there will be a short-term extension, maybe December 15th, maybe December 23rd, and possibly, and this is what they've been talking about most recently, punting, doing a short-term continuing resolution into about early next year, about February. So we'll see how that plays out. On the health care, we're now on our next slide. So we're talking about the budget. On health care, shortly after the Senate failed to pass the repeal and replace several times of the Affordable Care Act, the FY17 budget resolution expired, and that had the mechanism for health care legislation to pass in the Senate without a filibuster. Following this failed Obamacare repeal effort, the Trump administration declared that it would immediately cease making cost-sharing reduction payments subsidies to the health insurers. In the Senate, however, there is bipartisan legislation which was introduced by Patty Murray and Lamar Alexander to stabilize the health insurance markets by providing 2 years of subsidies and also providing more flexibilities and waivers to states. This bill could probably get the needed 60 votes to pass the Senate, but Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell said he will only bring it to the Senate floor if the president says he will sign it. And whether it can get through the House remains a question mark. If there is a year-end budget deal, this bill may be folded into it in some manner. The Child Health Insurance Program, CHIP. The CHIP program, it insures 9 million children nationwide. It expired on September 30th. States still have some funds to operate the program, but they're starting to run out right about now by the end of the year. Last Friday, House Republicans passed on a party line vote in the House a bill to extend the program, but it is paid for by a $6.35 billion cut to the Prevention and Public Health Fund, which the Democrats objected to. The Senate has a 5-year extension which retains the same eligibility requirements but does not include the offsetting budget cuts. So again, this needs to be resolved. It needs to be resolved before the end of the year. If there is an end-of-year package, this might likely get rolled into it. Tax reform. Last week, the House released, and right now the Ways and Means Committee is marking up, and they will be. This is a marathon session. It began yesterday. They're going to conclude probably on Thursday, their tax reform package. The bill lowers corporate and individual rates and increases the child tax credit to $1,600. It costs $1.98 trillion over 10 years. And it contains the following key provisions of interest to the city of Portland. State and local taxes. There's a compromise. They were going to get rid of it initially to continue to allow individuals to deduct state and local property taxes up to $10,000. But the deductibility of income taxes is repealed. New markets tax credits terminated after 2017. This has been a big tool for us here at the City of Portland. Private activity bonds, and this was a shock, I think, to everybody, are eliminated. It removes the federal subsidy for all private activity bonds, which include bonds that benefit nonprofit corporations, affordable multi-family housing projects, airports, student loan programs, and other programs. The low-income housing tax credit is preserved, but with the elimination of the private activity bonds, the 4% credit that is used for many projects is effectively eliminated. Historical tax rehabilitation historic rehabilitation tax credit is repealed. The tax-exempt status of municipal bonds is preserved, but the advanced refunding of bonds have been eliminated. And the commuter tax benefit, the pre-tax payroll deduction option is retained, but the ability for employers to be able to deduct the cost of this benefit is eliminated. Of particular concern to us, I think, of all of these, and they're not good, most of them, is the repeal of the PABs, the public activity bonds, which, coupled with the changes to the low-income tax credit, will have a significantly deleterious effect on affordable housing and on infrastructure in general. So the House will mark up and change this bill, and there were some changes made yesterday, but to none of these items. And the Senate will reveal their bill on Thursday. The recently passed FY18 budget resolution, similar to the FY17 one, which had the provision for passing health care and bypassing the filibuster, has a provision in it to bypass the filibuster in the Senate to pass tax reform. And the President has recently complicated an already complicated path to enactment by stating that he wants to include the repeal of ACA mandates in the tax reform package, although yesterday the Ways and Means Chairman pushed back on that a little bit.
Vicki,
So,
just a quick question.
Yes.
We know in the House the tax reform is going through Ways and Means. In the Senate, will the Senate's proposal go through regular order and go through Senator Wyden's committee?
It will. It will go through the Finance Committee.
And the second question is, has anyone done an analysis of the impact of the House proposal on a sort of typical middle-class Portland person that is a homeowner and is itemizing? And one of the things I haven't seen is sort of comparing that person with the proposed doubling of the standard deduction. Right. Versus that person if they were itemizing and deducting state and local taxes and mortgage interest.
What is the nexus? How do they?
Yeah, and I don't, my guess is someone is doing that. Oregon Center for Public Policy, someone is taking a look, but that would be interesting to know because there's going to be a debate about whether this is beneficial or negative for middle-class families. And one way of looking at it is taking, homeowners in Portland and seeing how would they be treated differently if we just went to a doubling of the standard deduction. So any citations you have on that you could point us to, I'd be interested in looking at it.
I've seen some of that material, but I don't want to speculate on what it actually says. So we will try and find that and get it for you. So we are going to obviously weigh in very strongly on the provisions in both the House and the Senate bills once the Senate bill has been revealed. Sanctuary cities is the next item on our list here. In July, Attorney General Jeff Sessions announced new requirements for recipients of the FY17 Byrne Memorial Justice Assistance Grants. Applicants were required to certify compliance with U.S. Code Section 1373 and also had to do some other compliance things like permitting the Department of Homeland Security personnel into any detention facility. And of course, the question becomes, how do you define detention facility? To meet with an undocumented immigrant, along with other requirements. The state of California and the city of Chicago immediately filed separate lawsuits, and in September, a U.S. district judge issued a preliminary injunction against the Attorney General, and the Department of Justice has yet to reveal these funds, waiting to see the outcome of these legal challenges. We get about $600,000 a year from this program, so that's being held up pending the review by the courts. On a broader scale, numerous bills have been introduced in Congress aimed at removing federal funds from so-called sanctuary cities, which are generally defined, but it depends bill to bill, as being non-compliant with Section 1373, which, just FYI, Section 1373 restricts state and local jurisdictions from implementing policies that prohibit the sharing of an individual's citizenship status or information with the federal government. And so far, none of these bills have become law. I think they're going to have a hard time passing in the Senate. And just for the record, the city of Portland is in compliance with Section 1373 and with Oregon law. On opioids, Last week, the White House Commission issued its final recommendations on the opioid epidemic, streamlining the federal funding for addiction, removing barriers to treatment, open drug courts in all federal jurisdictions, more opioid prescriber training, more emergency responders being able to deploy naloxone, and tougher prison sentences for fentanyl. It does not mention additional funding for opioids. The administration is, on their side, beginning to approve Medicaid waivers for states to design demonstration projects to let Medicaid pay for opioid use disorder treatments. 2 states have had their waivers approved. The administration declared an opioid epidemic as a public health emergency, which allows for expansion of access to telemedicine and for temporary federal personnel appointments to be made opioid specialists and expedited issuance of Department of Labor federal dislocated worker grants to assist those displaced from the workforce due to the opioid epidemic. But this also did not provide any additional funding. Again, if there is an end-of-year appropriations package, it is likely to include some additional funding for the opioid epidemic. And finally, DACA, the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. In September, Attorney General Jeff Sessions officially announced that the Trump administration was rescinding the DACA program. Subsequently, the Department of Homeland Security delayed the implementation of the rescission until March 5th, 2018, to allow Congress time to pass DACA-related legislation. A number of bills have been introduced in Congress, including the Bipartisan DREAM Act, Lindsey Graham of South Carolina and Dick Durbin of Illinois, which would allow for eligible individuals to apply gradually for naturalization. Democrats are opposed, and particularly Senator Kamala Harris from California, to any end-of-year appropriation deal, if there is one, that does not codify the DACA program. The president has recently stated that any legislative proposal for DACA recipients must also include funding for the physical barrier between the U.S. and Mexico, the wall. And he's also said there will be no year-end DACA deal. So as you can see, there are a lot of moving parts, not any of them anywhere close to being resolved. You will notice I haven't mentioned infrastructure because nobody's talking about that yet. It's supposed to happen after tax reform. We will continue to monitor all these activities and advance the city's priorities as outlined in our draft federal agenda, which I will now turn over to my colleague, Niels Tillstrom, to elaborate on. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Vicki. For the record, my name is Niels Tillstrom, and I'm the Federal Relations Manager in the Office of Government Relations. And so I'm going to walk you through the draft 2018 federal agenda, and we've made hard copies available for you, and it's also available on our website at portlandoregon.gov/OGR. As 2018 is the second session of the 115th Congress, we saw fit to amend the 2017 federal legislative agenda to reflect very similar issues. We began the process in September by soliciting bureaus and council offices for concepts and amendments, and in mid-October, Vicki Cram came out and joined us for 2 days of meetings with bureaus and council offices, as well as the Joint Office of Homeless Services. Excuse me. From there, we vetted any new language and amendments and have produced this draft. So the draft priorities for 2018 are as follows. The affordable housing, homelessness, and mental health and support services is still a top priority. We continue to advocate for funding for these programs as the city and also as the member of the West Coast Alliance of Mayors through the U.S. Conference of Mayors and through the city's Thrive initiative, which is being run out of the office of Mayor de Blasio in New York City. For 2018, we amended the language of the item to place emphasis on mental health. It was in the item previous, but we changed some of the verbiage just to call it out explicitly. The opioid crisis is a new item in 2016. I think Vicki laid this out nicely, but in 2016, Congress passed the Comprehensive Addiction and Recovery Act to advance treatment and prevention services. They provided funding for these, Congress provided, then Congress provided funding for these and other programs to combat opioid addiction. The hope is that with the emphasis of the current administration on opioids through the declaration of a public health emergency, that more avenues for use of these funds will be available to local governments to help those in need. And another item that Vicki covered was sanctuary cities, and as made clear, the administration is leading an aggressive campaign against quote-unquote sanctuary cities. The city has positioned itself with its own resolution, has provided support for legal actions, and this issue is something we're keeping very close tabs on. We continue to have an urban...
Can I ask you a question about that, Niels?
Sure.
The administration so far seems to be losing ground on the sanctuary city debate in the courts. And it's not just squishy liberals who are standing up to the administration's legal position, but even a Reagan-appointed circuit court judge in Chicago has now thrown down roadblocks. What is the likelihood of Congress actually taking up any of these particular strategies, given the legal uncertainty of the administration's overall strategy?
So I think given an election year in the House, you will probably see some bills that move, some language that may be attached to early appropriations bills. But on the outset, at the end of the day, it's not going to be something that's going to easily clear the Senate. So I think, there is this posturing that happens on an even year, especially in the House, but it doesn't necessarily come to bear fruit towards the end of the process.
Thank you.
So I don't see in here about the DREAM Act. And we have taken a council position in a previous term about that. So could that be part of the sanctuary cities discussion, or is that coming later?
Oh, it very well could. We could weave that into the sanctuary cities piece, and we'd be happy to work with you on language for that.
Yeah, I think it's good to have something positive to go for rather than defensive all the time.
Understood. Yeah, we would like to go for something positive as opposed to be on the defense.
Nils, I'm sorry.
Sure.
I haven't had enough caffeine this morning. I just want to go back to affordable housing. Could you go into the specifics of what we are lobbying for?
So what we did with affordable housing and homeless assistance and mental health support services was we divided it up into sort of three chunks as laid out in the title. The affordable housing piece, we're advocating for funding for this community development block grant, which is one of the most flexible pots of money available to cities, and the Housing Bureau uses that for affordable housing projects, as well as the PDC uses it for economic development
And that's
programs.
currently under threat, right?
It is something that we always have to support vocally, but it is very flexible, and it's seen across the country as one of those last sort of pots of money where cities actually, locals actually get to implement projects. Sorry, Vicki.
And the president proposed eliminating it in his budget, but Congress has funded it so far at level funding.
And the president in his first budget also zeroed out the home program, and that is something that, again, Congress saw fit to undo. And there are a number of those programs where they were off the mark, as it were, but they were making a point in their budget. But the affordable housing piece in our agenda also talks to the housing choice vouchers, the HUD-VASH program, and also the low-income housing tax credit, as well as speaking to the need to oppose any weakening of the protections under the Fair Housing Act. We included a piece on homeless assistance, and that covers both the work of or work under the McKinney-Vento Homeless Assistance Act, so the continuum of care programs, and the help the people living with AIDS housing options, and then also support for the United States Interagency Council on Homelessness, which is sort of the quarterback for the federal government across agencies to provide coordination for tackling homelessness across the country. And then the mental health and support services, the city is going to continue to advocate for the SAMHSA program, for SSVF, for supportive services for veteran families, and also work through different avenues to support other programs for mental health.
So under the category of affordable housing, it sounds like we're mostly advocating to keep resources that already exist. We're not necessarily advancing any new ideas.
Currently, that's our positioning, yeah.
Okay. I see Senator Wyden's ranking position on the Senate Finance Committee as a small glimmer of hope in the area of affordable housing and infrastructure in particular. And I know that he's actively looking for ideas. And when he asked me, I realized I've just been so hunkered down on Portland that it was hard for me to think big, but I'm now trying to think big. What could we suggest, on a national level that would help not just us, but
Well,
So-
and if I can add, one of the things that we need to fight really hard is this public activity bond elimination in the House tax bill and the removal of the 4% credit for the low-income housing tax credit. In the Senate, the chair of the Senate Finance Committee has authored legislation with Maria Cantwell from Washington to increase the low-income housing tax credit, and I think that's a place where we can, and we have been, but we can continue to advocate on that.
Yeah, and it's something to speak to the senator directly in December when you're there.
great, thank you.
You may have said this, but what do the asterisks mean?
Oh, yes, I'm sorry. The asterisks are new items to the 2018 agenda. I apologize. It's one of the things I forgot to mention. So we've talked about...
Well, and real quick, because you had the 115th Congress last 2 years, so the first session of the 115th Congress was 2017, and the second session is 2018. So this agenda updates the 2017 agenda based on the same Congress, but trying to address new political realities that are surfacing in the year ahead.
And so we have, so I'll skip, I was at the Urban Areas Security Initiative, I believe. Yeah. So the Urban Areas Security Initiative, as Vicki mentioned, it's still a priority. Portland Bureau of Emergency Management received $2.9 million to bolster regional preparedness work that they do. And we did amend the language this year to emphasize that the Department of Homeland Security should prioritize funding to the UASI regions that aim to meet FEMA's national preparedness goals of focusing on an all hazards response, so both man-made and natural disasters. And so we added tax reform to the priority list and enumerated different tax policies that impact the city. And as Vicki laid out, the House Ways and Means Committee has started the process, and their bill will continue to take shape over time or through this week. And we were going to work with the city budget office to provide some sort of context as how this bill, the House bill, and then maybe also the Senate bill, it will impact the city's functioning. And then we can also provide information to you, Commissioner Fish, about how this tax bill will impact Portlanders individually. The tax policies that we laid out highlight public investment in infrastructure and housing. And then finally, on our priority list, we'd moved up the Portland Harbor Superfund cleanup to a priority item out of a policy position. So recently we were able to have the entire Oregon congressional delegation write to the EPA asking them to press forward towards the cleanup. And this is no small feat, getting 7 members of different political views pointed in one direction. And we understand that this meant for us a level of importance for the project to move forward and what it means for all users of the river.
So my understanding is this week, Congressman Blumenauer has either introduced or will introduce the Superfund Tax Bill. Vicki, that sounds like a good one for us to send out a letter to the delegation of strong support.
Absolutely.
I believe it was Congressman Gingrich, who originally stripped it out.
Yeah, he let it expire.
Let it expire. This is one of Earl's handful of legislative priorities. I would hope that we could get a letter out of strong support, and it's not going anywhere, but the idea that we would tax polluters to fund a cleanup has a nice ring to it.
And every year, we propose a resolution in support of that at the U.S. Conference of Mayors meeting, and the Mayor Wheeler did that in June this year, and it's always passed and has been a part of the Conference of Mayors priorities.
Nick's right, though. I think we should be on the record supporting the congressman's.
Absolutely.
Perfect. So moving from the priorities to the policy positions, we retained the same themes from the 2017 agenda, protecting local decision-making, investing in vital infrastructure, and providing safety, public safety and resiliency. As part of the protecting local decision-making, we added smart and emerging transportation technology regulations, and this is to address a growing concern that there will be a federal preemption on the application of local traffic safety laws in order to facilitate the advancement of new technology, such as autonomous vehicles. And so we're currently working with PBOT and the National Association of City Traffic Officials to provide amendment language to a current Senate bill.
You have to give credit where credit's due. You know, the TNCs come into our town and run over consumers and regulators and workers. And then once we cut a deal, they go to Salem to try to preempt us from regulating. And when that fails, they've got a bipartisan work groups in Washington ready to preempt us. And by the way, I have a new policy in my office. Anything transportation related that uses the adjective smart, I'm against it, just on principle.
Understood. So I'd also like to highlight two other items on this list. The National Flood Insurance Program in compliance with the Endangered Species Act. In my daily parlance, it's the FEMA BIOP. This it has to do with a lawsuit that was filed against FEMA and the application of the Endangered Species Act as it relates to development in floodplains. And so currently, we are awaiting a bill that's actually moving to the House floor this week to extend the NFIP reauthorization which expires December 8th. Vicki talked about how fast things are moving. By the time it got to this end of the table for the conversation, we had this information. So we're waiting that, and then we're also, and that's in the House bill, the House side. The Senate has not yet to move on that, but we're also awaiting a record of decision from a programmatic environmental impact statement on the National Flood Insurance Program as it relates to the Endangered Species Act. So those are all things that are compounding the work that the city is doing in a joint work group. The other item that I'd like to call out is protecting local authority on revenue and telecommunication services enhancements. And there is currently a bill being considered by or at least being in draft form considered by the Commerce Committee on the Senate side that would preempt cities on a number of points, from local right-of-way to installation of telecommunications systems and facilities on any public facilities. So it'd be a light pole, it'd be a water tower, or a parks building, which they're currently leasing to a telecom company. There could be a potential loss of that revenue. And so we sat down last week as members from different bureaus that would be affected to work on some talking points and gather our resources. And we're now engaged in a conversation with several different stakeholders who actually went up to the Commerce Committee this week to talk about these issues. So we're already deeply engaged in that conversation. So moving from that.
Before you do, what's chemical security?
Chemical security. So there is this is a long-standing perennial issue for the Water Bureau, where how we actually treat. Vicki has this down.
It's legislation that might have an impact on being able to take chlorine and treat our water in the Bull Run. And that's what our concern is. It's a much broader issue area, but that's our level of concern.
Okay. Actually, when I was pondering what it may mean, I thought maybe it would be selling Valium over the counter to help us all feel better. And that reminded me that a new local decision-making that we want to protect is cannabis sales for both medical and recreational.
Mm-hmm.
That
actually ends up in the last section of this piece, but we can get to that in a second. So we made in the second theme, we made no amendments in the investing in vital infrastructure theme, save for moving Portland Harbor to the priority list. But I wanted to highlight quickly just two items. The Willamette River restoration projects, which are a set of Water Resources Development Act projects that we had authorized in the last, at the end of the last Congress, and we are currently working on getting funding for those projects, the first of which is a open bottom culvert to Tryon Creek, to enhance fish habitat. There's been so much work done upstream in the Tryon Creek watershed, but the fish have not been able to fully get there because of this last 400 feet under Highway 43. And so then also the Capital Improvement Grants Program from the Department of Transportation. This was another item that was a lot of which was zeroed out under the Trump administration's first budget, and because of widespread congressional support, continues to receive funding. And I think that just speaks to the actual appetite of transportation projects and funding them at the federal level. So I wanted to make sure that was included. And then in the last theme, providing public safety and resiliency, we added two items, Wildfire Funding, which highlights the need for a fix to issues that the U.S. Forest Service and Department of Interior face each year when they're required to divert funds and staff away from existing programs towards fighting fires. And this is called fire borrowing. You may have heard that in the press. And there is currently legislation from in the Senate led by Senator Wyden, which would establish a funding mechanism similar to funding that other agencies get to recover from floods and hurricanes and tornadoes. And so the Water Bureau actually sees an impact from this because each year the work that they do with the Forest Service in relation to their joint projects in the Bull Run watershed are slowed down because staff is actually diverted, physically removed from their work here to go do work on fire recovery as funding. So it impacts us because of this. Because as of yet, the federal government has not seen wildfire as the same level as natural disaster as hurricanes or tornadoes or floods. And then finally, an additional item was the waters of the United States. The Clean Water Act gives the federal government jurisdiction over the waters of the United States. And this definition of the waters is quite contentious, and BES has a strong interest in a science-based definition because as a utility, they are subject to regulations, but also BES regulates the actions of private and public entities that discharge into waterways and wetlands and drainages, and therefore is responsible for their actions under the Clean Water Act. And then this theme is of public safety and resiliency is where the issue of federal cannabis regulation sits.
Why is it under public safety and resiliency?
We could move it to, I think it was a past discussion with the Office of Neighborhood Involvement.
It could be that regulating it and making sure that it's done safely is a way to do it.
Yeah, and it could also be under the first theme, which
local control.
Which is local control. So it's a conversation to have.
Yeah, it doesn't really make any difference, does it?
Okay.
I mean, in terms of, because these are not ranked in priority order either, right?
Correct.
That's correct.
Just a couple of comments. First of all, it's really an excellent presentation, and this is a very complex subject matter, and you've presented it very clearly in a straightforward way. It does seem like a lot of our emphasis is in the sort of do no harm area, where we're playing a lot of defense, and that's understandable. I'm pleased that we're going to send a letter in support of Earl's tax proposal. I support Commissioner Fritz's suggestion that we include the DREAM Act, and the fact that our two senators have been so outspoken and visible on that issue, I think is important that we support them. In the spirit of the protecting local decision-making around arts funding for public funding for the arts, I would urge us to include legal services. There's never been a time when legal services was more important to more people. And they are also serving people who are at risk of some of these new policies that we're opposing. So I think I would urge us to include, in the same kind of way we've crafted protecting funding for arts and the humanities, protecting funding for legal services. Even at the current levels, we're only serving 1 in 5 eligible families. But if that's a family that's facing deportation or an eviction or whatever, I think we should be on record as supporting that. And we have strong allies, obviously, in the delegation. And then finally, Vicki, there's a lot in here that affects the utilities, and there's a lot of uncertainty about the regulatory environment. So what I don't see as boldly stated this year is anything around LT2. Is that because you think we're out of the woods, or is there some other reason why that's not as high profile in terms of monitoring further regulations that could have a big cost impact on us?
Well, we can certainly add that if you would like to.
Well, I know you monitor it.
Added, because we do continue to monitor any regulations that affect the Water Bureau and the purity of our water.
I guess we don't. Are we aware of any current legislative action which would materially affect us through the LT2 process?
Not that I'm aware of.
Because I for one support elevating Superfund in significance for all the obvious reasons. And there's a number of issues which affect, which relate to clean water and water safety and regulatory environment. It's not framed in the same way, and it may not be necessary in this cycle. And I know that you're monitoring it. I'm satisfied with the fact that we continue to monitor, okay. And if there's a challenge, you'll bring that to our attention.
Absolutely.
Does anyone object to the legal service inclusion?
That's good.
I know we're not voting here, but I just want to. Thank you.
I'd like to ask a question about framing. Is there, I'm too far removed from Washington, D.C., which I think is probably a good thing to really know the answer to this question. In the Senate in particular, is there any acknowledgement that the West Coast of the United States is in the midst of a homeless crisis? And I understand that we have sort of deconstructed homelessness through our agenda here. We have mental health requests, we have housing requests, we have opioid and addiction requests, and we have other economic requests. But there is more press, and yesterday I think was just about the most definitive I've seen, where it describes the West Coast as facing a collective crisis around homelessness. 10 cities on the West Coast have now declared states of emergency. We're somewhat fortunate, as awful as the situation is here, our unsheltered population actually went down 12% between the last point in time counts. LA just went up 49%. They just announced. And that's more typical of what we're seeing across the West Coast. Even small rural communities are starting to see dramatic increases in the homelessness population. And rather than just having esoteric or academic conversations about housing or opioids or mental health services as separate conversations in separate committees, is there anybody actually describing it for what it is, which is a widespread homelessness catastrophe on the West Coast that requires a substantial intervention? I understand that people can get kind of removed from this being in Washington, D.C., but I'm just curious to know if that narrative has hit the Beltway yet.
I think it's hit the Beltway in terms of the Senate offices that represent, you asked specifically about the Senate, but I would say the House offices too, that represent West Coast states. And West Coast, including Nevada and Colorado, I mean, Denver and Las Vegas have similar issues, so it's broader than just the actual West Coast. I think the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness has a good awareness of what's happening on the West Coast.
And they've been very present at the
And they've been very
conference.
present in all of this and in the coordination efforts. I'm not sure that it has permeated the entire Senate or the House in terms of that recognition, but I know that our delegation from Oregon, but also California and Washington and Nevada and Colorado are all very concerned about this.
So we now have a West Coast Conference of Mayors, and this is obviously front and center for all of us. But I am wondering, as you go back to DC, if you have your conversations with people, is there more we could be doing to make it clear that this really is as serious an issue here as the hurricane is to Houston or as other natural or man-made catastrophes are elsewhere? This isn't the same sort of immediate one-time issue, but it is pervasive and it is growing, and it requires intervention from Washington, D.C. And if there's a way for us to help push that narrative, I'd like for us to be very aggressive in doing so.
Thank you. We will
Not
be.
just as separate policy issues. They're all linked.
Yep, we understand.
Mayor, the only qualification I would offer is I don't think this is a West Coast crisis. It's a national crisis. And the difference between New York City and Portland, other than size, is that they're under a court order, a decree to provide shelter on demand. And so they, on any given night, provide shelter to, I'm just going to make this up, but something like 20 to 30 times the number of people
Probably
that we
right.
offer shelter to.
Yeah.
And that's just the tip of the iceberg. It's a national problem. It's particularly acute in cities like Los Angeles, which are making huge investments, but have seen, not long ago, a court ruled that there's over 50,000 unsheltered people in the city of Los Angeles. So you start taking our size, comparing us to bigger cities proportionally, you realize that it's a national problem. What has been frustrating for us is that the issue of housing generally has not been a top-tier issue for a long time in Washington. And I regret to say, even during the Obama years, it was not one of the issues that Obama regularly, used the bully pulpit to advance. And now we have, Dr. Carson in charge of HUD, and his primary qualification, as I understand it, is he checked that he was a homeowner on his application. But I mean, this is where we are, and it's a national crisis. But I think the only hope we have from what I'm hearing from our team is that some of the market-based tools that Congress has supported in the past may continue to get support in the Senate. So the voucher programs, low-income tax programs, which, by the way, is not the world's greatest thing for us. The low-income tax credit program, because of all the strings attached, makes housing development more expensive. If we could be, if Ted could be king for a day, what we'd want is as much CDBG with as few strings as possible to address, to customize our own needs, but that's not the environment we're in.
Well, I'd appreciate that, king for a day opportunity. I stipulate what you're saying, Commissioner Fish. It is a national crisis, particularly acute on the West Coast where housing prices are going bonkers relative to other cities across the country. But there's no question that what you say with regard to Washington backing off on housing support is absolutely core to this conversation. I believe a statistic I heard recently was that since the 1980s, support through HUD for affordable housing has decreased by 85%. And that has pushed the burden all the way downstream to cities. And obviously we don't have the same kind of capacity or revenue generation opportunities as the federal government. So it's made our job a little stickier. But I stipulate what you're saying absolutely. And I just feel like if there's a way for us as a city that is severely impacted by this issue to have a bigger voice or to push harder, I'd like to know how and where we do that.
Thank you, Mayor. That will be part of the strategy going forward. And I appreciate the conversation about this sort of passing of the buck down to cities, because it's something that, as an office that deals with the federal government and the state government and to a lesser extent regionally with our partners, we see that happening incrementally, just even in the time that I've been at the city.
Vicki, before we lose you on the federal side, could you give us a quick tutorial on what could change in the Senate that would trigger the Byrd rule and require more than 51 votes?
Well, I think an election could change that.
With respect to tax reform.
Oh, tax reform.
So they right now have structured it so that they have to find offsets, and there's a, but what technically has to happen in the process to shift from a 51 vote scenario to actually a 60 vote scenario? Do you know?
Well, I think they would have to not have a, I think you're correct, they would have to not comply with the Byrd rule, which means there needs to be an offset for the tax reform package, which the House package is not fully paid for. But I think, you know.
That's why we're hearing talk of bringing the ACA into the conversation.
And that's why we're hearing talk of bringing the Affordable Care Act, which brings, I think, $400 billion into the conversation, which helps to offset the 1.98, at least the cost of the House bill, which is not fully offset. So that's one of the reasons that they have been bringing that up.
So I'd like to add to the policy themes 303, domestic violence prevention and also human trafficking prevention and treatment. And then I have a question. I don't notice anything about comprehensive immigration reform in here. Is that just because that's such a wild thing that we are not going to get it? The best we can hope for is not to build the wall?
In the approach to this agenda that you are certainly reading between the lines, and it's targeting those areas where we need to provide the most protection, and to the best of my knowledge, there's not legislation that's moving that would address comprehensive reform.
So something I've been experiencing for the last 10 months or so is that every day there's a new something that we have to defend against. So what's the process for somebody, I don't know who it would be, comes up with a new something that we need to then vigorously oppose?
Well, and I think we build that sort of flexibility into our program so that there are always things that are unanticipated at the beginning of the year that might happen. And of course, we will cycle back with all of you to make sure you're comfortable with whatever position we take.
And one of the features in the drafting of this is to create language that does provide sort of a central nucleus position, but then a little bit thinner out on the edge to catch potentially some of those unknowns. But as we've seen in this year, there are a lot of things that we didn't know could be attacked. So we will make sure that we are ready for those this time around.
Well, personally, I'd have a comprehensive whatever Senator Merkley wants, I support. I don't think he's done anything so far in Congress that I have not agreed with. So if you could keep that in your mind, let me know when. You know, I actually learned from the legislative agenda training that we did, and also previous ones, that people at the federal level clicking on the website that says send a message to your congressperson, they do actually count them. Mm-hmm. And I got a nice form letter back from Congressman Schrader, having clicked on that. Of course, at the local level, that's not helpful at all. But just for those who might be watching at home, that's not quite as futile as it might seem.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, my first job in the Senate was actually reading and researching responses to all of those submissions. Mm-hmm. It's a full-time job.
Same here.
Yeah.
Come tutor people in my office. It's a daunting task.
We'd be happy to.
Yeah.
Not that they're doing a great job, but
it takes some resilience, and people. Yeah, I think it's a gift that people think to contact their elected officials, that we can do something to help better their lives, but it can be a lot. Yeah.
It's like think globally, but also act locally, right? There's a real opportunities we have is at the local level, as far as I'm concerned.
Absolutely. Any other questions or comments on the federal agenda?
Thank you, Vicky. I really appreciate your work.
Thank you.
Well done, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, and Nils as well. Thank you.
So I'm going to stay here and call up Dan Eisenbeis, and we will shift to the state agenda.
Good morning.
So Dan Eisenbeis, interim director, or interim state government relations manager, and Eric Knoll is our associate. And Eric has been helping out with both the state and federal agendas. I apologize for not introducing you before. So we started the, it's a good sign, we started the process of building the 2018 state legislative agenda in August, which was just a few weeks after the close of the 2017 long legislative session. And so since then, we've been working on researching and vetting concepts for inclusion in this draft. And going into a short session that can last a maximum of 35 days, we provided some factors for consideration to our legislative liaisons to think about how well vetted a particular concept is and how time sensitive it is, looking at the dynamics of a short legislative session, if something might be better suited for 2019 for a long session. One of the challenges in this short session environment is that it goes by so fast. There's not an opportunity to build the same coalitions, work through issues, build consensus, because after a week and a half, you're through the first chamber deadline. So those were some things that we sort of put before our legislative liaisons when they were considering items to submit as part of our agenda building process. Now, since August, we've been meeting with other governmental partners, folks in nonprofit and business groups to determine potential areas of collaboration. We've also reached out to our legislative delegation as well as legislators from around the state to get a good sense of what bills and measures may be introduced in this upcoming legislative session. So the first sort of substantive slide here is a snapshot of the timeline, and I'll actually start with a quick look back to last week. Monday, October 30th, in the evening at ERCO, we held our Advocacy 101 event. This has become an annual event that's a partnership between the Office of Neighborhood Involvement and Government Relations, wherein we work to provide community members with an opportunity to learn how to effectively engage with the state legislature. We had 4 great panelists, Representative Janelle Bynum, State Senator Michael Dembrow, Mary Moeller from the Governor's Office, and Vivian Satterfield from Opal. Following Advocacy 101, we had a community forum with Commissioners Daly and Fritz, wherein attendees could share their input on the state legislative agenda and the issues impacting them, and we heard a wide array of feedback from community members, including topics like housing and homelessness, mental health services, conflict minerals, sanctuary cities, funding for infrastructure, and jurisdictional transfer, to kind of name some of the more popular items that came up during the forum.
You forgot bicycle license fee.
That didn't get any votes, but it was prized. So now looking ahead, one thing I'll note on this timeline here is that the dates that are in italics are for the state legislature, and the dates that are in regular font are city dates. Next week, Dan and I and Eric will be down in Salem for November legislative days. Those are 3 days when the committees convene and they discuss policy implementation, potential future legislation, general education, fact-finding. And of particular note is the week after that, on November 21st, that is the deadline for legislators to submit their bill draft requests. So that's a Tuesday. We are working in a very constrained environment for this short session. Senators only have 1 bill request. House members get 2. Committees get 3. The governor and the judiciary branch both get 5. So it's a very narrow environment. Most, what we would call vehicles, most bills are accounted for at this point, but we wanted to get this discussion in place before that
So I have a Legislature 101 question, and I meant to ask you before, and I forgot. Who gets to decide how many bills everybody gets to introduce?
That's determined by the chambers. So they'll set it in their chamber rules for the particular session.
So the chambers determine how many bills the governor gets to submit?
That's correct.
The legislature at the end of last session passed a joint resolution that spelled out those bill limits.
That's fascinating to me. Interesting. Thank you. That's my civics lesson for the day.
Good point.
Have you picked the date yet for the Portland Legislative Breakfast?
No, not yet.
Could I just put a plug in for, it sounds like you're going to do it sometime after the 8th of January?
Yes, sir.
So sometime later that week or the next week?
Or it could be anytime before February 5th.
So all I would say is my preference would be later that week or the week of the 15th.
We'll work around that.
Thank you.
Yep. Okay. So we will be coming back before you on December 13th with final drafts of both the state and federal agenda. So this is the window where we're working on refining and honing these drafts that are before you. In January, there will be another round of legislative days. There are technically organizational days, which is this sort of beefed up version of legislative days, and we'll see bills daylighted at that point in time. Then we'll work on the precise date for the legislative breakfast, inviting members of the Portland delegation here to City Hall, where we can talk about the city's priorities and hear from them and discuss areas of collaboration with our state legislators. And then session begins on February 5th and must adjourn by March 11th, although the projected signing die date is March 9th. So we are 4 months out from the close of the 2018 legislative session, in case anyone's counting. So looking ahead just at the actual overview of the legislature, the balance of power remains the same as in 2017. So Kate Brown is still our governor. The majority leaders from both chambers represent Portland and actually where we're sitting right now in Southwest Portland and Northwest Portland. The Speaker of the House is from North and Northeast Portland, so we have a lot of great representation at the state. Democrats continue to hold majorities in both chambers, but they are 1 vote shy also in both chambers from supermajorities. That's that 3/5 vote threshold that allows you to pass revenue-raising measures. So it's an important break point. We're also going to see a lot of new faces. So although we're not currently in an election year, per your question earlier, we're seeing there are going to be a number of new legislators due to resignations and appointments, including 2 new members of the Portland delegation. So in September, now Representative Andrea Salinas was appointed to fill a seat vacated by former Representative Ann Leininger when she was appointed to the Clackamas County Circuit Court. And in the last 2 weeks, Representative Mark Johnson from Hood River and John Huffman from the Dalles have both resigned to start new jobs with the Oregon Business and Industry Association and also USDA, respectively. So the other seats that are could throw some curveballs into the Senate are Governor Brown nominated Senator Richard Devlin of Tualatin, also includes part of Southwest Portland, so that's our second Portland legislator, and Senator Ted Ferrioli from John Day to the Northwest Power and Conservation Council, pending Senate approval at next week's November legislative days. So the implications for this could be widespread. Senator Richard Devlin holds the gavel on the Powerful Ways and Means Committee, and Senator Ted Ferrioli has been the longstanding Republican leader in the Senate side. So you have some big positions that will likely be opening up. And we anticipate that the successors will be appointed before short session, but because the resignations haven't happened yet, we don't really have a good sense of the timeline. So we're in a little bit of a gray period.
So I'll just say a nice thing about Senator Devlin. I think he's indispensable as far as budget writing, and that's a big hole to fill. But he has earned whatever he would like to do with his next phase of life. But I just want to say I have found him utterly indispensable in that role.
He certainly has the respect of his colleagues and members of the lobby for being a skilled budget writer, and it is those are big shoes to fill.
And his constituents, who I am one of.
Well, with that lay of the land, I'm actually going to turn things over to Dan to talk a little bit about both the financial setting that we're going into and talk about, walk us through the draft state agenda.
Good morning. Again, for the record, Dan Eisenbeiss, Interim State Government Relations Manager. So speaking of the budget, there are potential ballot measure impacts related to the budget and the short session. Short sessions, of course, occur during election years and in the context of potential ballot measures in the fall. 2018 is unique in that there will be a special election on January 23rd on Measure 101, which is a referendum of portions of the healthcare assessment approved by legislators in 2017. The outcome of that special election will have a major impact on the short session. Rejection of the referral would decrease state revenue by approximately $200 to $300 million directly. And that state funding also leverages federal Medicaid funding at a 3-to-1 ratio. Looking out to the fall ballot, initiative petitions are already being filed. And notable proposals include prohibiting taxes on groceries, expanding the definition of revenue-raising legislation that's subject to that 3/5 majority requirement for legislative passage, as well as requiring public bodies to dedicate revenue exceeding population and inflation-based spending limits for reducing unfunded PERS liabilities.
With the proposed, sorry, Commissioner, the prohibiting tax on groceries, that would preempt the sugar tax if that were to be approved in Multnomah County. Is that correct?
It has that potential.
Interesting.
You know, this is the ballot in 2018 reminds me that there's a lot of chatter about things that could show up on the May 2018 ballot and the November 2018 ballot. Everything from renewal of the children's levy to a corporate tax measure to fund green building practices to a potential campaign finance proposal and the like. Is it possible for you on our behalf to compile a list of everything that's being talked about so we have some advance warning? The council is going to have to make some decisions about potential referrals next year on some items or sequencing. I know that for me, for example, next year is the year I'm very interested in finding a potential new revenue source to augment what we're doing with the housing bond on the service side, and whether there's a bunch of ideas being floated. But again, everybody's going to have their own priorities and sequence. What often happens is it becomes like a demolition derby with all these ideas cascading and with a rush to the filing. Could you compile a list of all the things that are being talked about so that we have some advance notice?
We're happy to do a review and circle back with your office. It, of course, is going to change and morph over time.
And just to be clear, these are things that the council may be asked to refer, things that people may be collecting signatures on, things that are at the concept level but are being talked about, just so we have some lay of the land. And, you know, I've mentioned 3. I think there's a bunch of others that are out there, but I think you're in a better position to take the temperature and give us an update. And I think until there's a filing, that's appropriate, right? We're just monitoring what are some of these new revenue ideas and other good government ideas that are floating. And some of them, as I say, may come to the council with people trying to see if we'll refer them or not. But I'd like to have a comprehensive list of what's out there, at least that we're currently aware of.
We'll take a look and do a review. And as you referenced, we take a very conservative approach as public employees. So up until the time of filing.
Up until the time of filing. So now it's just a matter of it's a matter of public record that things are or not being considered. But I'm not asking you to make judgments on them, just to give us a heads up of what's being considered.
Understood.
Thank you.
So turning to likely issues in the 2018 short session, as mentioned, in the event that voters reject Measure 101, the short session will be dominated by addressing the budget and the shortfall in Medicaid funding. Housing also continues to be a priority for the legislature. Other high-profile issues that will be considered in the short session include proposals to mitigate climate change, establish a statewide paid family leave policy, as well as close loopholes in gun safety laws. In addition, we anticipate legislation to implement forthcoming recommendations from the Opioid Epidemic Task Force, fixes to the transportation funding package passed last session, proposals to reduce airborne toxins, and to potentially implement concepts from the governor's PERS Unfunded Liability Task Force. Turning to the draft 2018 legislative agenda before you, this is structured with 4 major issue areas: affordable and stable housing, healthy environment, community livability and public health, as well as local funding and authority. The first item in the affordable and stable housing section is referral of a constitutional amendment to Oregon voters for the fall 2018 ballot to expand municipal bonding authority for affordable housing. Currently, lending of credit limits in the state constitution mean affordable housing projects funded through a local government general obligation bond must be owned and controlled by the local government. This amendment would allow a local government to leverage financing from private or nonprofit partners. The draft agenda also includes support for expanding the...
Before you go off that, I want to get on the record here on this one. I strongly support that constitutional amendment. And it's my understanding it's also a priority for the House Speaker, if I'm not mistaken. It'll eliminate what is currently a fairly significant barrier to leveraging general bonding capacity. What it would do is it would open the door to public-private partnerships, and that would allow us to take our GO bonds and leverage those with low-income housing tax credits to significantly increase our ability to invest in affordable housing. And some of the more conservative estimates in terms of what this would do is that it could potentially increase the number of affordable housing units by as much as 30%. And so this is an opportunity for us to bring in the private sector in a more significant way and open the spigot towards more partnerships around affordable housing. So I very much want us to get behind this particular effort.
Mayor, thank you for those comments. And the city has been actively coordinating with the speaker and others to move that forward.
Good, and I also think there's a win here with rural Oregon. This is one I believe we can get our colleagues around the state energized by. Under the current prohibitions, it requires the municipal government to both be the owner and the operator of GO-funded housing projects. And a lot of communities around the state can't afford to actually deliver on that function. And so if they had this ability to enter into the public-private partnership sphere, they'd be able to do this. And so I'd love to see us be able to go down this road. And it's going to require a hard push. I have been in the arena before around constitutional amendments in order to increase our ability and our flexibility around bonding capacity. And it's a steep road to climb. And so it's going to require a full-throated response and support from us to make it happen.
Thank you for those comments.
I also support this, but I'm curious, what is the main opposition to this change, or what was the thinking behind this decision to begin with? Because
it has to go to the ballot, and Oregon has an interesting constitution in that we wrote in acceptable uses of debt into our state constitution. So anytime you want to expand the use of general obligation bonding capacity, you actually have to take it out to the voters. And the first thing the title says is constitutional amendment to ... And there's a very, very high threshold for constitutional amendments. And in recent years, there has been a movement to add language to constitutional amendments around bonding capacity that says, so it starts with constitutional amendment to ... increases indebtedness. And so it's a very high bar. And so that means that the public discussion has to be very overt. There has to be a lot of transparency, and the messaging has to be solid in terms of what the value added is to the taxpayers. And I think there's tons of value added here for the taxpayers.
So the hurdle is public perception more than any kind of substantial policy dispute? Is that?
Commissioner Udaly, if I may, I believe the mayor is exactly right that amending the Constitution is a very high bar, but I would characterize the phase that we are in with this effort as one of continuing to build support and conduct due diligence. At this point, there has not been opposition expressed to this concept,
Great.
which is great news.
Yeah, thank you.
So moving on, the draft agenda also includes support for expanding the document recording fee to invest in housing opportunity. The funds raised by the document recording fee are dedicated to support for low and very low income Oregonians through emergency housing assistance, expanding the supply of affordable housing and permanent supportive housing, as well as home buyer down payment assistance. I should note that this is one of those items that is subject to a 3/5 majority requirement. The third component of the housing section in the draft state agenda is support for establishing a task force on addressing racial disparities in homeownership. A task force would be charged with compiling data on levels of homeownership amongst people of color in Oregon, as well as identifying barriers to homeownership and access to mortgage loans, identifying practices that deliberately discriminate against people of color, and recommending solutions. Turning to the healthy environment section, the first item is supporting clean energy jobs legislation, establishing a cap and invest program to reduce carbon pollution and mitigate the impact of climate change. The other component of this section is support for reducing airborne toxins. This includes support for additional funding to implement the Cleaner Air Oregon program, as well as support for legislation to reduce diesel emissions. In the community livability and public health section, the first item is funding to improve community livability through management of Odot property. This will enable better coordination between the city and Odot. The other item.
But could I just ask that I'd like us to be somewhat careful about the language. It's not that we're criticizing Odot for the management of its property. They very much would like to partner with us. They just don't have the resources or the personnel to be able to do so. So we're very much approaching them in the spirit of collaboration to help them get additional resources from the legislature. So I just want to make sure that that's the frame. We're not there to beat Odot over the head. We're there to partner with them.
Who is likely to lead that particular bill?
That would be an effort, a joint effort between the city and Odot.
But in terms of, that each senator gets one bill, representatives get two, etc.
We're currently in conversations with State Representative Jeff Reardon from the Lentz area, which has been one of the areas disproportionately impacted by camping and the inability to coordinate as well as we would like to around that neighborhood.
And is it your sense that particularly the Portland delegation is kind of chatting with each other to make sure that between all of them they're covering some of the highest priorities for Portland?
Yes, absolutely, and that's one of the roles that Speaker Kotek also plays in her leadership, is making sure her members are covering the broad breadth of issues impacting not just their caucus, but the city of Portland.
Thank you.
Following up on that, I mean, we're talking about what our agenda is, but folks who have districts within the city are going to be putting in their bills. I know Senator Frederick has a bill that he's very keen on about, I think, training for public safety officers, and you're going to see lots of other things. Would you remind us, what's the process we go through to evaluate the concerns, the priorities of our partners locally, and deciding whether we either support or stay neutral on some of the new issues that will be raised?
So, Commissioner, when we get into a legislative session, some of this will occur earlier, but in sort of the day-to-day, we use our bill tracking software and work with our legislative liaisons and identify issues that we think impact different bureaus and different offices, and we get in touch with those bureaus and those offices and say, does this raise any concern from you? This seems like something you've addressed in the past as wanting to support. So having that institutional knowledge and those relationships at the city is very helpful when we see legislation and then farm it out to our issue and policy experts here. Does that make, that's a long-winded answer.
It just seems to me in a short session where, let's say, state senators get a single bill they can put in, it behooves us to track that very closely, see whether those legislative initiatives align with what we're doing, and if they do, obviously give our early support. And if they don't, figure out how we deal with that, because it's a delicate matter. If someone is allowed to put one bill in, we're going to have to assume that this is a bill they care deeply about. And so where do we land on it, and do we expand our agenda to include it or not? Be interesting to see how this unfolds.
And we will have so part of our outreach to legislators over the past months have been finding out what are those top 1, 2, 3 issues. Maybe they have one in the queue if they're talking with their colleagues and maybe trading an idea, and are trying to keep track of who's introducing what.
I see.
And, you know, by the 21st, by the week after next, they will have had to make that decision about what they want their 1 or 2 bills to be.
Does the legislative breakfast we're hosting give us a chance to have a further conversation about those issues?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, and it's an ongoing process over time.
The other item in the community livability and public health section is addiction and mental health, including opioids. The city supports improving access to treatment, educational resources for providers and patients, as well as additional resources for mental health services and treatment.
Who might carry that? Or those?
So, as I mentioned earlier, in respect to opioids, there is a opioid epidemic task force that has one more meeting on its calendar, I believe next week. The governor has indicated that she plans to put forth legislation to implement some of those recommendations.
Around opioids?
Yes.
Okay. How much do we communicate with the county when we're developing our agenda? At all? Or?
Dan and I reach out to our colleagues at the county, the other government relations professionals there with some frequency to look for areas of collaboration, alignment, and see if there are things that we can advance together, or to make sure we're not stepping on each other's toes.
Sure.
But it's done on a more informal basis.
Okay, because I'm in pretty regular communication with Commissioner Myron about addiction and mental health issues. So we're currently working on a joint kind of press release and public education project around fentanyl in particular, and as well as just kind of ongoing. She's doing some really interesting work on kind of assessing our entire mental health system. So I would just suggest that we connect with her moving forward.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, we will.
We actually just did a huge roundtable with Congressman Blumenauer. There were so many people in the room that by the time everyone finished introducing themselves and what programs or organizations they represented, it was over, but it was fascinating to have all those people in the room and to realize some of the gaps really started to emerge with, there were probably a good 25 or more people in that room. So it's an area of particular interest to me, and I'm sure others. So keep me posted.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Lastly, the draft legislative agenda includes local funding and authority. The city will strongly oppose efforts to limit its authority to develop and enforce local ordinances, manage its bureaus and their functions, and raise local revenue. Conversely, the city will support efforts to remove state barriers to local action. And in the draft agenda before you, there is a list of some of the types of preemption proposals that we've seen or otherwise anticipate.
And we've bolded those out on the front page just to make it a little bit easier.
Starting with background checks,
Correct.
that list.
Yeah, and actually on background checks, that is a more affirmative effort. We're looking at both administrative or legislative venues to gain access to the law enforcement data system for the independent police review and the portion of the Revenue Bureau.
I don't see on this list preempting our authority to regulate TNCs. Is that because you do not expect that to come back this short session?
We ended up couching it as regulation of emerging technologies to couple together both TNCs and autonomous vehicles because there ends up being a lot of overlap between those two particular issues.
Okay. In a short session, though, given the complexity of that issue, is it likely to come up or less likely?
TNCs are less likely to come up, but we will be vigilant because you have to be.
Yes, we do.
I was visited by a constituent who's concerned about fluoridation, water fluoridation coming up again. So I would hope you would be continuing to be vigilant about local communities' power to do that, to make the decision, which ours has very clearly done.
We will continue to monitor for that, but I personally have not heard of legislation in the short session on that issue.
And similarly, you did mention earlier that the forum that Commissioner Udaly and I hosted, the conflict minerals, and I think that the advocates for that are well aware that that's not something that's likely to come up in the short session, but did a good job of explaining to other engaged people why we should look at it for the long session.
Mm-hmm. Well said.
Nicely done.
Yeah.
Very good. Anything other you'd like to discuss, Elizabeth?
So I can speak very briefly to next steps. We'll work to refine these drafts, circulate them with your offices by early December, and then we'll be back before you on December 13th with the final versions. And then we'll also be working with your offices to get the legislative breakfast scheduled. And with that, I'd like to thank each of you and your staffs for helping us put together these big, lofty agendas.
Very good. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Excellent presentation. We're adjourned.